The features of the Australian landscape are of great importance to the Aboriginal peoples who have long inhabited the land. Naturally, stories of its origins and development feature prominently in the mythology found across the island. For example, groups who have traditionally inhabited coastal areas generally have many legends concerning the sea. Interestingly, many of these groups have stories that tell that, long ago, the coast was much further back than it is today, and that, one day, for reasons often attributed to the acts of various mythological figures, a great flood came, and sea levels rose permanently, which their ancestors were present to observe. For example, the Goonganiji people of modern-day Cape Grafton in Queensland believe that the area that is now the Great Barrier Reef was once dry land where trees grew and animals roamed. However, one day, a man named Gunya ate a forbidden fish from the sea. The gods noticed this and sent a great flood over the land to drown him and his family. Gunya was able to escape by moving to higher ground, but the waters never retracted, and his homeland was submerged forever. On the opposite end of the island, near Cape Chatham, there is a story which holds that there was once a great plain that extended far out into what is now the sea. But, one day, a great flood came over the land and submerged it forever. 2 women, who were deep in the plain picking roots, were drowned and transformed into the Calf and Cow rocks in Broke Inlet. It is generally not surprising that the cultures of Australia would have similar myths, as they are related to each other, after all. But what stands out about these Aboriginal flood stories is that scientists have determined that sea levels were indeed once lower, and many of the descriptions presented in these stories seem to accurately describe the landscape one would expect to have observed in Australia as a result. How long ago were these floods exactly? On average, about 10,000 years ago. This was brought to light in a 2016 paper by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, listed in the description, who found 21 examples of stories in Aboriginal mythology from across the island that describe floods or inundations that are generally consistent with what scientists believe really occurred in ancient Australia. Aboriginal Australians preserved what they knew about the world verbally. Stories like these were maintained as oral traditions. We might expect that the reliability of oral records of information that wasn't essential for daily survival, such as myths and legends, would be short-lived, that very small things would inevitably be changed, confused, or forgotten by each generation until it either no longer resembled what was once held or disappeared entirely. Indeed, these authors mention that the consensus among historians was that such oral traditions could only last intact for roughly 800 years. And yet, these remarkably accurate legends might suggest that Aboriginal Australians may have successfully transmitted specific stories which, though mythologized, might have been based on eyewitness observations of real historical events across 10,000 years without writing them down once. That is amazing. For comparison, the earliest written story, of which we have a record, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a mere 4,000 years old. Fascinatingly, this is not the only example of this kind of thing, nor is it the oldest. Researchers have found numerous examples of stories and elements within stories from cultures around the world that are suspected, for one reason or another, of being extraordinarily ancient. In fact, there are so many examples of this that we couldn't possibly share every example in this video. However, we will be discussing several very interesting ones, including what may be humanity's oldest story. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. Some of you may recall that we have made comments about this sort of thing in a few of our past videos. We are very excited to finally be able to make a video focusing on the subject. So, let's get to it. Another example of a potentially extremely ancient story comes from North America. With a depth of nearly 600 meters or 2,000 feet, Crater Lake in Oregon is one of the deepest lakes in the world. The Klamath tribe, native to this region, have long told an epic tale which describes how they believe the lake formed. As is discussed in Ella E. Clark's 2003 book, Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest, the Klamath claim that, long ago, there was no lake, but rather an opening to the below world. From this opening, the chief of the below world, Lau, would sometimes venture into our world. One day, Lau looked out from his mountain and saw a beautiful woman named Loha, who was the daughter of a local chief. He went to speak with her and asked her to be his wife. Loha refused, but Lau persisted in his request, which drove Loha to flee. Her refusal infuriated Lau, and he vowed to destroy her tribe in revenge. He rose to the top of the mountain and prepared to unleash his wrath upon the surrounding world. However, at the same time, Skell, the chief of the above world, came down from his home among the stars and landed on nearby Mount Shasta to intercept Lau and prevent this destruction. Lau and Skell entered into a great battle, which all the spirits of the earth and sky would come to join. The battle shook the earth. Giant red-hot rocks flew through the air. Fire engulfed the forests and villages, and ash rained down from the sky. As the people retreated in terror, 2 medicine men declared that Skell had allowed this, the curse of fire, to happen as a punishment for the sins of their people, sins which must be atoned for by sacrifice. The 2 medicine men chose to sacrifice themselves. They climbed to the top of the raging, fiery mountain and jumped into the pit. Skell, content with this honorable sacrifice, then drove Lau back into the below world, collapsing the mountain on top of him. Rains then fell and filled the hole that was left by the collapse, creating the lake. There are a few different versions of this story, but they are each quite similar to this one. Interestingly, this story, first recorded by an American soldier speaking to a Klamath chief in 1865, before scientists knew much about Crater Lake, sounds quite a bit like a mythological explanation for a volcanic eruption. It wasn't until almost 40 years later, in 1902, that geologists Joseph S. Diller and Horace B. Patton first proposed that Crater Lake was, indeed, formed in a massive volcanic eruption, in which so much material was ejected that the mountain collapsed in on itself. Over time, the caldera filled with water, creating Crater Lake. The research done since continues to support this explanation, and geologists currently estimate that this eruption took place around 7,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence proves that indigenous Americans were, in fact, inhabiting the area at the time of the eruption. But is it really possible that the Klamath could have preserved this story for so long? It is difficult to prove definitively that this story is derived from eyewitness accounts of a real ancient event. The same could be said about Australia and the stories of its coasts. People across the world have always told stories about the development of the lands in which they live. Most of them are made up and inaccurate. Every once in a while, you would expect a lucky guess. However, in both of these cases, we find oddly specific descriptions that bear quite a bit of resemblance to what scientists have independently worked out really happened, which the ancestors of these peoples would have been present to have observed. It is difficult to believe that these are just coincidences. Indeed, the simplest explanation seems to be that these myths are derived from observations of real events. Are ancient tales of the development of geographic features the only things that were preserved, or is it possible that other details of our distant past were preserved as well? What about descriptions of long-extinct animals? We have argued in our Campfire series that studying unusual subjects like cryptozoology could be worthwhile even if the creatures aren't real. Here, we find an example of this. Some have speculated that a handful of cryptids and mythical creatures may have developed from stories of real creatures which went extinct in prehistory. One candidate for this possibility is a cryptid of South America called the Mapinguari. As we discussed more thoroughly in our Cryptids of South America video, the Mapinguari is described as a large, hairy beast that roams the Amazon rainforest. It is sometimes claimed to have a horse-like face, long, sharp claws, reddish fur, and what are described as backwards or crooked feet. It is said to be the height of a man and may walk on either 2 legs or 4, but will assume a defensive posture by standing on 2. Dr. David Oren is a leading expert on Mapinguari mythology. He revived the 19th century suggestion that the Mapinguari legends could somehow relate to extinct animals called ground sloths in a paper published in 1993, followed by another in 2001. Ground sloths are animals that once lived throughout the Americas, which went extinct in prehistory. They did not closely resemble the sloths that still exist in South and Central America today. Rather, they were large, tall creatures that could weigh hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. They walked on 4 legs but seemed to have been comfortable standing on 2 to eat leaves from trees and to defend themselves. Their extinction on the mainland seems to have begun around 12 to 11,000 years ago. By this point, humans were living in the Americas. The last of them persisted on islands in the Caribbean until roughly 4,000 years ago. Oren noted that many traits that the Mapinguari is sometimes said to have somewhat resemble traits that ground sloths are believed to have had. As one example, while on 4 legs, the claws of a ground sloth would have been pointed backwards, giving the appearance of the backwards feet attributed to the Mapinguari. Oren is of the opinion that the legends suggest that there could be a remnant population of ground sloths still living in the Amazon. This is not likely. However, some believe that the Mapinguari myth could still descend from a cultural memory of ground sloths. Again though, to be clear, this is pure speculation. There is no evidence that this is actually the case, nor is there even much specifically suggesting it to be like there is in the previous 2 examples. And to be fair and to avoid cherry-picking, in many versions of the legend, the Mapinguari bears little resemblance to ground sloths, nor any other known creature, extinct or living, for that matter, having instead an ape-like body, cyclops eye, and a mouth on its abdomen. Another candidate is a creature found in Aboriginal Australian mythology, called a bunyip. The bunyip is usually described as a large, aggressive, quadrupedal, semi-aquatic monster that dwells in rivers, swamps, and lagoons. In 1871, Australian naturalist Dr. George Bennett proposed that the bunyip legend could have come from a kind of cultural memory of an extinct animal known as a diprotodon, a possibility which remains in consideration to this day. If you can believe it, the wildlife of Australia was once even more diverse and extreme than it is now, with many fantastic creatures having gone extinct before recorded history. Diprotodon was essentially a large herbivorous marsupial, a bit smaller than a rhino, that is believed to have inhabited the savannas and plains of Australia. It's not often suggested that it was semi-aquatic, though even if not, it, or its fossils, could have still inspired the legend. Even if not, a multitude of other extinct creatures have been considered as the source of the legend as well. While this idea remains very popular in some circles, it is, admittedly, not very strong. Again, there is not much specifically suggesting that this is the case, and there is not even a consistent idea across Australia of what the bunyip is exactly. Furthermore, it should be mentioned again that anything to do with cryptids and mythical creatures in this regard remains highly speculative. Even if some of them are derived from cultural memories of long-extinct animals, it would be difficult to ever be sure, given humanity's knack for inventing completely fictional creatures. We must not make the mistake of concluding that 2 things are related merely because they superficially seem similar. Victorian scholars, like those who first proposed that these creatures could have been based on real animals, were fascinated by the possibility that myths and folklore could have very ancient origins. However, they were very given to making this mistake, and sometimes, in fact, went wild with assumptions to support these proposed connections. Some of these elaborate theories turned out to be wrong, but persist regardless, so we stress caution when researching this area. While these examples are lacking in compelling evidence, and are admittedly a bit of a stretch, they are nevertheless possibilities. We mention them both as cautionary tales, and because we believe the subject as a whole is worth further investigation and consideration. The suggestion that these stories come from ancient observations of living Diprotodon, and not just of fossils, is made even more bold by the fact that this creature is believed to have gone extinct likely around 25 to 50,000 years ago. This would make the Bunyip legend as much as 5 times as old as the stories of the changes to Australia's coasts. Is it even possible that a legend could truly persist for not just 10,000, but 25 to 50,000 years? This could be possible. There are other examples of Aboriginal Australian mythology that researchers are more confident date back roughly as far. The Gunditjmara people of southeastern Australia have a legend centered around a volcano in their homeland called Buj Bim, which geologist Aaron Machen believes is, much like with the Klamath of North America, a legend inspired by a real historical event, a real eruption. The Gunditjmara tell of a giant who walked across the landscape, then crouched down and transformed into the mountain. As he transformed, his teeth turned to lava that shot into the sky. Geologists believe that the last time this volcano erupted was 37,000 years ago, a length of time roughly 5 times greater than that of Crater Lake. In the quest to find humanity's oldest stories, some researchers suggest looking up. While the night sky does change, it does so very, very slowly, to the extent that the way it looks today is very similar to how it has looked throughout human history. If stories associated with ancient geographic features have persisted for eons, is it possible that the stories we tell of the stars have as well? Many researchers think that, in some cases, yes. In Western astronomy, most of the constellations and many of the asterisms of the night sky in the Northern Hemisphere were created by the ancient Greeks, although many of them were based on older forms originating in ancient Mesopotamia. However, there is some evidence to suggest that, in at least a few cases, the Greeks and Mesopotamians derived their star legends from far, far older traditions. The Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters, is a famous asterism made up of a prominent cluster of stars located within the constellation Taurus the Bull. It can be found throughout much of the year by drawing a line from Orion's belt in the direction of the star called Aldebaran, and then past Aldebaran until you reach what looks like a fuzzy patch of stars. These are the Pleiades. The Greeks told a handful of different stories about these stars. However, the main legend held that the Pleiades were the daughters of Atlas, the Titan ordered by Zeus to hold the sky on his shoulders for eternity, and Pleione, a water nymph, from whom the sisters derived their name. Once Atlas was condemned to hold up the heavens, the sisters lost their protector. One day, Orion the Hunter found the sisters and began to chase them. The sisters cried out to the gods, begging to be rescued. Zeus heard their cries and answered them, transforming the maidens into doves and then into stars. The interesting thing about the Seven Sisters is that there are 6 of them. Well, some claim to be able to see more stars under the right circumstances, but most people can only see 6, and indeed astronomers from the ancients like Aratus of Soli to the early modern era wrote that there were only 6. The Greeks had a few different mythological explanations for the absence of the seventh sister, such as claiming that the sister known as Merope hid in shame for having fallen in love with a mortal man, this being Sisyphus. What is even more interesting though, in fact, downright fascinating, is that other cultures around the world also regarded these stars as a group of 7 in their mythologies, while acknowledging that only 6 were actually apparent as well. Not only that, but in the mythology of some of these cultures, including very distant ones, these stars represent 7 women being chased by stars in the constellation Orion the Hunter. Most Aboriginal Australian groups regarded the Pleiades as the 7 Dreamtime sisters, who were chased by either men or a man, it varies, represented by stars in the next-door constellation of Orion the Hunter. Many held that the 7th sister had died, however, and was thus no longer visible. The Sioux of the Great Plains in North America told that the stars were created one night when 7 women were chased by a bear. As they fled, they prayed to the Great Spirit to save them. The Great Spirit heard their cries and answered them, and raised the ground on which they stood high into the sky and placed them among the stars, creating the Pleiades and the Devil's Tower in the process. Though they tell of 7 women, the Sioux do not seem to have a missing star legend, at least not one we could find, but other Native American groups do. The Cherokee, like many Native North American groups, saw the stars as 7 boys. They held that these 7 boys, tired of being scolded by their mothers for playing instead of working, performed a dance that slowly lifted them into the heavens. However, one of the boys' mothers caught one in time and pulled him back down to the earth. There are numerous other examples of stories like this in places like the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. Some cultures disagree with themselves on whether there are 6 or 7 stars in their stories. Some only see 6. The Japanese, for example, who call the asterism Subaru, see only 6 stars. However, so many cultures told of 7 stars, and often 7 figures represented by the stars, mainly women who were raised into the sky to evade a threat that was chasing them, that it arouses curiosity. This raises 2 questions. Firstly, could these superficially similar legends be related? And secondly, why do so many cultures tell of a missing 7th star? To answer the first question, in the 2009 book Emu Dreaming, an introduction to Australian Aboriginal mythology, Ray Norris and Scylla Norris first proposed that it was possible that the Greek and Australian myths do share a common ancestor. This topic was revisited in a 2020 paper titled Why Are There 7 Sisters by Ray Norris and Barnaby Norris. Because of how deeply embedded these stories are in their respective cultures' mythologies, it is considered unlikely that they are a product of modern European influence. Thus, if they do have a common ancestor, it would be nothing short of extraordinary. It would suggest that the myth was created before the Greek, Aboriginal Australian, and Native American cultures had diverged from each other. This would have been, at the latest, 60,000 years ago. Meaning the story is at least that old, though likely older, perhaps 100,000 years old, if not even older than that. This makes it a strong candidate for humanity's oldest preserved story. 100,000 years. Such a vast span of time makes Rome, the pyramids, and the invention of farming seem like yesterday, and even dwarfs the huge spans of time we've so far discussed in this video. The idea that we have been consistently transmitting this story, roughly, across such a time span is mind-boggling, amazing. Now, before we get too excited, we should be very careful. The fact that multiple different cultures have a legend relating to a malevolent figure chasing a group of women in this region of the sky is not proof in itself that they are connected. The stars in question are very prominent. In fact, beginner astronomers often use Orion's belt and the Pleiades as starting points to find other stars, because of how distinctive and easily found they are, like we did at the beginning of this section. Thus, it is to be expected that many cultures would focus more attention and mythology on them. Things like hunters and sisters are very basic things that all ancient human societies would have inevitably seen in the sky. And as an article by LiveScience.com pointed out, it does appear that the hunter stars are chasing the sister stars because of Earth's rotation. Thus, it is entirely possible that multiple different cultures, each independently, invented these simple stories. The study of mythology and folklore is plagued by the habit of not merely hypothesizing, but confidently concluding that 2 things must be related because they have vague similarities on the surface. We must be very careful to remember that it is possible for separate cultures to independently have similar or even the same ideas. However, regarding our second question, why do so many cultures tell of a missing 7th star, the idea that each culture independently decided that there was a missing 7th star in the group by complete coincidence arbitrarily is not likely. Not merely a 7th star, again, There seems to have always been some debate about how many stars exactly one can see here with the naked eye. Some people to this day claim to see 6, 7, 9, and even 16 stars depending on visibility and eyesight, which has added some confusion to the conversation, but of a missing 7th star specifically, one whose disappearance each of these cultures felt the need to explain in their mythologies. Again, the answer may lie in the very ancient past. The Pleiades are a cluster of over 1,000 stars, only a handful of which are visible to the naked eye. However, some of them are so close together that they appear as single stars to the naked eye, such as the stars Pleione and Atlas. To avoid confusion, yes, in Greek mythology, Pleione and Atlas were the parents of the Pleiades, but in modern astronomy, they are the names of 2 of the stars in the Pleiades, including one of the visible 6, this being Atlas. Norris and Norris argue that there are 2 reasons people of the past might have seen a 7th star. The first is that a now dim star was much brighter in the past, which is a possibility as these stars are variable, meaning their brightness can fluctuate over time. The second is that 2 of the stars were once further apart. Again, stars do move, very, very slowly, but they do move. In their paper, Norris and Norris cited evidence that suggests that the stars Pleione and Atlas were, historically, further apart, enough to where they might have been perceived as 2 separate stars by the naked eye. They argue that this would have been the case about 100,000 years ago. Essentially, the idea is that this story of 7 figures, possibly originally women evading a threatening attacker, may have first been told in Africa roughly 100,000 years ago. However, as the millennia passed, at some point before recorded history, the star Pleione became obscured by the star Atlas as they moved closer. The elders of these societies, not wanting to alter what would have been basically a sacrosanct story and claim that the ancestors were wrong and that there are actually only 6 stars, instead invented an explanation for the 7th's disappearance. Either that, or this is evidence of a prehistoric Cardassian visit to Earth. Not everyone agrees with these ideas. Dr. David Schaefer of Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, speaking to LiveScience.com, is also skeptical that there is sufficient evidence to demonstrate an actual relation between the legends. He also pointed out that the astronomical data suggesting that the stars were historically further apart that was used by Norris and Norris was outdated, and that current estimates suggest that the stars haven't actually moved much in the past 100,000 years. These are important criticisms, although the article does not mention any explanation for why so many are convinced of a missing 7th star. The simplest explanation is that there was a prominent 7th star there many thousands of years ago, although admittedly, we do not know of anything that would assure us this was 100,000 years ago. It's possible that the star disappeared more recently after humans had traversed the globe, and that everyone noticed and independently invented their own explanation. Alternatively, if only 6 stars were visible 100,000 years ago, could this suggest that the memory of the prominent 7th star is even older? In summary, do the tales of the Pleiades as 7 women being chased by an attacker, seen in multiple cultures around the world, have a common origin 60,000 or more years ago? It's possible, but we certainly cannot say that it is definitely the case. In fact, we cannot even say probably with confidence. These could very easily be coincidences. Secondly, why do so many cultures have a missing 7th star legend? Again, the simplest explanation is that there was a much more prominent member of the Pleiades in the past, before recorded history, although it's hard to know when this was. Ultimately, it's an extremely interesting subject, but we do advise caution. Fascinatingly, the stars of Taurus and Orion are not the only stars whose stories may be extraordinarily old. As we have mentioned in past videos, some, like Dr. Yuri Berezkin of the St. Petersburg Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, believe that this is the case for the constellation Ursa Major, and that many of the legends associated with the stars of this constellation, across much of Eurasia and the Americas, descend from a single cosmic hunt myth first told roughly 50,000 years ago. Astronomers like Schaefer mention that this theory is better substantiated by the evidence than the Pleiades common ancestor theory. It should be clarified that not all constellations, and perhaps not even most of them, are stupendously ancient. A few, even in the northern hemisphere like Camelopardalis, are very recent inventions. Indeed, the purpose of this video is not to argue that all myths have extremely ancient origins or that they are all derived from at least a kernel of truth. Most mythology is much more recent and entirely made up. However, examples like these do suggest that sometimes this may be the case. Why is it then that some oral traditions are more static and unchanging than others, such that while some struggle to last a millennium in their original form, others last 100 millennia? It is difficult to say for certain. Many of the researchers we have cited in this video have speculated on the answers to this question. There are a few things most of these myths seem to have in common. Firstly, extraordinarily ancient stories seem to belong to extraordinarily ancient cultures. It is no coincidence that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were the stars of this episode. Australia was for the most part isolated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. Aboriginal culture, lifestyle, and mythology was therefore allowed to persist without being influenced or overwritten by others until the 18th century. Secondly, these legends seem to strike a perfect balance between being sacred and unprovocative or mundane, for lack of a better word. These groups consider these myths sacred enough for their preservation to be deemed necessary and for alterations to be considered unacceptable, but they are not generally the sort of stories on which people dwell or become worked up about or seek to embellish. Finally, these stories focus on things like mountains and stars, things that remain mostly stagnant for eons. Natural human curiosity about how these permanent features came to be doubtlessly encouraged the constant retelling of these stories. The final question is, what else could be hiding in the world's mythologies? This we leave for another time. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, we invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. To support the channel further, there is a link to our Patreon in the description. A special thanks to our current supporters listed here. Thank you for watching.